Members, the Housing Committee on the State Sector and Public Finance Reform Bill is resumed. When the committee was considering this bill before the dinner break, we were debating Part 1. Dr David Clark had the call and he has 4 minutes and 43 seconds remaining.
Mr Chair.
Dr David Clark.
Well, Mr Chair, when I was rudely interrupted by the dinner bells, I was discussing the strengthened role of the State Services Commissioner and the effects of the changes to the amendments to the State Sector Act 1988. And I was about to introduce a pertinent example as to why this is important policy. These new powers will give a formalisation to the role of the Commissioner. It will also mean that he has the ability to transfer, or she, the ability to transfer chief executives within the public service as a vacancy arises. It gives them the ability and responsibility for ministers and chief executives to have a greater interest in the stewardship of the interests of the Crown and departments in the medium and long term. Now, an example of this might be if a government, a future government, for example, had a priority to change the way in which the electricity system worked. Now, as it happens, currently, the Prime Minister has said he thinks that Kiwis are paying about the fair amount for power prices. Most New Zealanders, no, he did say that. Most New Zealanders think that power prices are far too high, but the Prime Minister thinks that they're about right. Now, Labour sides with most New Zealanders in thinking we should have a fair price for power.
What up?
I am coming to a point here,
well, you better be.
Mr Chair, which is that if we wish to change the policy, it would involve very much the implementation by the public sector, by people who are tasked with implementing changes. Whether you agreed with the policy, Mr Chair, not meaning you, whether people agreed with the policy or not, if changes need to be made, this flows on to the responsibility of ministers and agencies concerned, and these additional powers should ease the ability to change policies. So where one party's decided that capitalising the value of free water isn't the fair way to build your system, where you think the cost of electricity shouldn't rise at double the rate of inflation for the last 15 years, and you wish to implement a new policy which says instead of the long-run marginal cost, you would look instead at a model that looked at a fair return on capital and paid only the marginal cost for new generation. You could implement that, not you, Mr Speaker, but the government of the day could implement that change through the powers of the State Services Commissioner filling a vacancy in a relevant department and/or having the sanctions and rewards necessary, as long as that department hadn't been privatised, as my colleague alludes to, subject to the normal powers. There is a wider range of abilities, or a strengthened range of abilities, for the State Services Commissioner to effect change. That, at least in theory, is partly how this legislation could play out. And we in Labour think that that's a good thing, and that's why we will be supporting this bill. The government thinks it's a good thing also. It should enable them to achieve their objectives more easily if they have any that are clear and in the interests of New Zealand. There's no accounting for bad policy. If a government has bad policy, or no idea or no plan about how it's going to get ahead, and we've argued often on this side of the House that this government seems to have no direction, no plan, then that can't be accounted for by this legislation. This legislation really is about implementing the plan. If the government does have a plan, how will it be implemented? What is the role of the State Services Commissioner? That will be spelt out more clearly. How does that flow on to chief executives in the public service? What are the implications for their workloads, the way that their responsibilities are set up, and that flows into the state sector system as a whole. So if, like members of this side of the House, good policies are put forward and the party has the opportunity in government to implement them, this State Sector Act amendment bill will allow for those policies to actually take effect and actually make a difference for real New Zealanders. So, Mr Chair, that is why we'll be supporting the bill. We're satisfied with what's been achieved in terms of protecting the arrangements for state sector workers, the redundancy provisions that have been improved as opposed to what was originally proposed, the transitional arrangements, the conflict of interest protections, all of those things that were negotiated in the Select Committee are fought for strongly by the Labor Party, along with the PSA and the CTU.
Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise